of all the other experiments we're running, um, adding the tablet PC, which was awesome, and I threw Jamboard in there because also why not? And the course I used this in was upper division elective, that's histology, that is predominantly visuals, right? So it's looking at things and knowing what you're looking at and labeling them and appreciating that. So given the visual nature of this, I think Jamboard was a really good fit. So what I threw up there is just like the blank Jamboard that you can pull up. It's not, um, if you ever played with these Google apps, not one of the things that comes up. So you sort of have to, in the new, you have to go into more, and then it's one of the additional pieces that comes up. So there's lots of things you can add and control in here. That's really nice. So you can just use a pen and annotate. You can erase what you've done. You can move things. You can add text with a sticky note. You can add text through a text box. You can add different shapes. What I did a lot was add images, so you can look for them out in the web, or what I had was image files that I had, so I would click and drag and add them in. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then there's other things that are like pointers that I didn't use so much. One thing I did note is that I can see all of these things when I use the computer, but I lose some of these pieces when I do it on the tablet. So there are some things that you lose. The text box is one of the pieces that you lose in there. So it's a little bit different if you're gonna make them straight from the tablet. So just keeping that in mind. So one of the first experiments I ran was to have the students use the whiteboard. There you go. So this slide, the computer, I just told them to draw an animal. So the first thing that should strike you is that there is a crying need for a stronger arts program at Fisher. The second thing you should note is that they could do it. So I was the only one with an iPad and a pencil. I had one student who had a stylus, one or two who had touchpads, but predominantly they had laptops. So every single student had a laptop. They did it on their own. It was sort of one of those things that I said, hey, if you have one, bring it. But they were already ready. So they're seniors and they sort of knew. So most of them were doing this using their finger on the, so, they look like, they actually look like the animals. You could predict it. So the point of I was trying to get to them was that the brain's really good at pattern recognition. So no matter how creatively they interpreted these animals and drew them, you could still recognize what they are, right? So this class is really about learning some pattern recognition. So if you want to do something like this also speaks to the fact that, they can do a pretty good job if you give them something like a table, something to fill out. They could fill out a grid or a table or something. What my class was doing was more like this. So I would give them a slide. I would give them a task of what it is that they're supposed to be doing. I provided the image in the back, and then they would go through and add in the labels. So they added labels. They could add text labels. Some chose to put the sticky note bits. They could draw in lines so they could tell me where these places are. They also could then go in places. So they would be doing this the way that I'd set it up. They were in folders for each of these weeks. So in any given week on Blackboard, I would share the link for that Google folder. So for this particular activity, then I made original one. I tell them to make a copy. So they make a copy within the Google folder so it shows up. And then during class, what I do is just go through each one of theirs. So I could use my iPad, I could project it up on the screen. They're looking at their groups and working on it, and I'm rotating through each one of them, and then I can give them feedback because I can use it on my tablet. And then if there's things they're all, mistakes they're making in common, I grab their attention and be like, hey, let's everybody look at the screen and let's go over this piece. And then if not, I could go through and essentially correct each one of theirs. And I was able to do that fairly easily within that time span. So this was a Tuesday, Thursday class, so it was an hour and 20 minutes. So they got feedback before they left the classroom that day. So they were doing things like this, and then I would go through and either confirm that things were correct, which is where the smiley faces came from. So they needed smiley faces on all their slides before they left. And if not, I could go through and actually correct and give them comments. So there's like leftover remnants of my stylus pieces, like bits and pieces where I told them to look at stuff. They also were able to go through, I wonder if this one has an example. So sometimes I actually sent them off to websites. So go off to that place, go find the image, and they're very easily able to do a screen capture, upload an image themselves, and then add all these pieces in there. So this worked really well because again, this is highly, image-based. This is what they had to do. But I could definitely see if I put a table or a chart up there, if I told them to annotate some other things, annotate graphs, annotate something they're reading and a passage. So it worked really, really well for that. And it worked, I think, much better than PowerPoint because of the capacity to do this free drawing piece to it. What else? So I like their bits. I've asked the students for feedback about it. So their biggest complaint is the lack of color options. They would like more colors. Given the nature of the type of images we have, I can appreciate it because about half of those colors just don't work. They're lost. So I can appreciate where they're saying that. There is something about it doesn't always like upload or work correctly. So sometimes for maybe every third time you try to open one of it, it just has an error and then you have to go back and sort of start it again and try it again to get it to open. But it could be because I have such huge image files in there and I'm like partially crashing this entire system, and that's maybe on me that I did that. So, but even then it can handle it really well. So we could do all this stuff live sharing, and then you can always, when they were all done, they could share it with me. So they could download it as a PDF, they could keep it for themselves, they could download it as an assignment and have it. So for me, it worked out really well, live in person and then as a study tool later. Okay, that's my bits. I can stop sharing.
Great. So, and just to clarify, so you gave them that example file, they made copies of it, and then they worked in a smaller group on each one of those versions?
Yeah, and I left them to pick their own groups because they're seniors and they know each other really well. So I had groups, a couple of groups, and some were just pairs and some were groups of 4. And this was COVID time, so they're all sitting at their own devices, but they're still in close enough proximity that they could just do a little bit of that communication of like, you're wrong, let's go change this to this other thing.
Yeah.
And then when we went to Zoom, they all went into breakout rooms based on those groups, and I could still sit in the main room and like give them all this feedback, and if they needed help, they would like grab me into their breakout room.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
So I have a quick question for you. So this was, they were all had their own individual decks, right? Have you, for this particular, like each student had their own version, right? That they marked.
The groups had one. So I made one master, and I told them the first thing you're going to do is make your group a copy.
Okay, group copies. Okay,
Yeah.
That was my question. So like it was effective to do this as like multiple people editing and together. And
yeah, they all had their own, and it took about 2 classes to get them to do the copy correctly so that it stayed in our master folder, so I could go between them. Because otherwise they were like sharing it with me, and to have it live in 15 different places makes it really hard to try to go between them. So one of the key things I realized is like everything's got to live in that one folder for me to be able to go through these quickly in a class.
I've also seen a Jamboard setup where it'd be hard in your case because you've got a whole series of images that they're going through. But I've seen instructors create just one Jamboard, but basically a separate slide that's just duplicated for each of the groups, and just label it at the top, this image, but for group 1, this image, same image, but for group 2, for group 3, for group 4. So it's really all the same Jamboard. And that's what's really unique about Jamboard, is that it's not just one whiteboard. It's like a slide deck, but each of them being a separate whiteboard, that you can interact with. So however you kind of organize and structure that based on the activity, can be pretty different from one group to another.